very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. How Gollop ended our last program with an examination of the role played by village shops in the overall development of the community. Now, as you are aware, the harvesting of the sugar canes and the many activities of the sugar factory were ranked high among the more important events that occurred in the community in any calendar year. This week, How Gollop begins by looking at the interplay of those activities associated with the sugar crop and the importance of this to the community space.
The crop was the high point of the activity for the year. And there's something which might sound strange to younger Barbadians. During the crop season, all the artisans dung their tools. Carpenters, masons, whatever. They dung their tools and went and worked in the crop. Very important, because that crop was important to the place. Sugar was king, and Barbados was doing extremely well in those days in sugar. Some time ago, while a student at Erdison College, did some research into the sugar industry, and I can tell you that we recorded as high as 250 tons of sugar in this country over a period. So everybody dunged his tools and went and worked in the crop. Now, if they were lucky to get into the factory, there were bigger wages there available. So at the end of the crop season then, you went back to your normal trade, your normal activity, whether you were a carpenter or a mason or a painter or what have you. But that was the transition. Everything was made ready for the crop. We can see just behind that grape tree there, sea grape tree I think it is, the chimney of Carrington factory there, just to the left there. If you were lucky to get a job there at the factory, well then you stood to have greater earnings than if you were involved cutting the canes, as it were. But that was a feature of life around these plantations, where cane growing and was the thing. All the artisans got involved during the crop season. And at the end, they went back to their trades as a painter or a carpenter or a mason, as the case may be. But they did not only operate in the village. They got on their bicycles and they rode all over the place to fix up some house for somebody or paint some house. I remember as a boy seeing a group of men riding to town on bicycles through this village. They were all artisans, and they were going various places to ply their trade. For example, there are certain things that seem to become peculiar to some parishes. St. George always seemed to produce a larger number of masons than any other parish. As a matter of fact, again, the influence of the factory, the two factories, I happen to know something about brick laying, because bricks, those engineering bricks, clear bricks, were important for the boilers, setting up the thing on the boilers. The only bricklayers in Barbados seemed to come from St. George. And there was a man who traveled in a buggy, a Mr. Corbin, who would pass through Burton in his buggy during the off-season, going to make sure that the bricks were properly laid for the coming crop. And you could almost tell what parish produced what kind of artisan. But as I can tell you, St. George seemed to produce more masons than any other parish, and certainly all the bricklayers. And that was a thing too, which growing up in the village, you became acquainted with, because it had an impact on you. Mr. Corbin passing through in his buggy had an impact on every youngster in Britain. First thing, a buggy, and then the next thing, a black man in a buggy coming through this village, a horse with his buggy, which was a Rolls Royce to the donkey cart. You know, the donkey cart with the rough wheels. I mean, this buggy had springs, and this horse trotting beautifully through Britain on a morning and trotting back down with Mr. Corbin, I think his name, yes, going up to Carrington to get the boilers ready for the coming crop. And those things became known. It became known.
Yes, they became known to a young Hal Gollop, and we have provided him the opportunity to pass on that information to future generations. Now, speaking of passing on information, Hal Gollop shares his experiences of harvesting sugarcane on his father's plot of land.
My father had a plot of land, a half acre, which was a reasonably sizable plot for the average peasant farmer. And we cut those canes. And I could tell you, Daddy paid us for it. So, well, we had to fork the land occasionally. You're required to do your little bit. And if you, like all of us did, if you like eating roast corns, like we did, we reveled in an opportunity to plant a little patch of corns. But I did have some personal experience. It wasn't always a bit more pleasant, because holding a cane bill, you don't have the thing, they didn't have like these nice collins, people call them nowadays, that were light. A bill of much heavier metal thing. You had to cut canes with them. The collins is a much more recent development that was brought into Barbados by people out of St. Vincent and St. Lucia. And all the boys in the village, at some point or the other, would chip in and help the family to save expense. Because if you were able to get your family involved in the reaping of the plot which you have of canes, you didn't have to pay out to somebody at the wages that were then going at the time. So all of us had some experience to a greater or lesser extent. Mine was restricted to the few holes I would cut with on my father's half acre. But some people did have a great experience in that. But those things didn't do you any harm. You benefited from that kind of experience. The village agriculture, mainly interested in canes. But every now and again, you would hear that you had to rest the ground, give it a rest. And you would plant some yams, potatoes, cassava, everything that you could possibly plant. Corn, I just mentioned, cucumbers, everything, so that the family plot at some point would grow all those things over a period. But cane was the main thing. Of course, in the village kind of environment, the dray cart. You know a dray cart? You see one in operation? You're not old enough to know a dray. Yeah, the horse mule drawn cart. That was the vehicle of the day that took part with the drawing of the peasant canes. Occasionally somebody would be able to hire somebody's lorry to draw them, but you couldn't wait for a lorry. The lorry were few and far between. You had to get somebody's mule and cart to come and draw the canes. And if, for example, the ground was wet, that was a challenge, a real challenge. And you had to prop and you push and you prop and you push to get that cart coming out of a field. If there was a slight incline, as our land had an out incline, what we call, if the canes was coming out of the bottom, that you had to get that cart. Every man had to come and put his hand to the wheel, as it were, to get that mule and the cart out of the thing. But yes, they did also take part in food crops when they were giving the ground a rest. They didn't want to deplete the nutrients in the soil. And of course, in those days too, since everybody kept animals, there was a ready supply of natural fertilizer from the grass and the dung from the animals, which were used to fertilize, especially those food crops, yams and potatoes. You made sure that the land had a copious supply. Another thing too, the plantations allowed a privilege to some people to cut what we call the sour grass, because they needed it to mulch the fields. So you couldn't go and cut a plantation sour grass with impunity. But some people were given the privilege to cut that sour grass and to feed the cows, whatever, or sheep, because there was something, a reciprocal benefit for them. They would then send their carts at a particular time when the cow pen, was sufficiently high, piled up with this dung, to collect the dung from these people who had the privilege of cutting the sour grass, to then mulch the fields, to fertilize the crops of yam and something at the plantation. So all of that too, growing up in the village, you became very aware of. You couldn't just, as I said, you couldn't just cut these people's grass with impunity. And you know, growing up here as a boy in Burton, we had the contrast between these two plantations. Bentley on the left, Edgecombe on the right. And we always saw the manager there, owner, or part owner, whatever, proprietor, we'll use a better word, the other word, of Bentley, as a much more liberal person. And we would graze our sheep and cows all through these avenues and so on. And often, cricket has to be played whatever you're doing. The cows grazing, and you playing cricket, and the cow going into to the field or something. And that was something which was tolerated over here at Bentley. When you went down the road with your cow, you knew you couldn't go over by Edgecombe, because there was always a fear that if you went over there, you might have to go and pay something for your cow for going into the field at Edgecombe. And that kind of contrast was reflected among the people in the village. The people at Edgecombe being much more austere and all of that, while the people at Bentley being much more liberal. And we became aware of Mr. Armstrong's seriousness as a planter. He was a phenomenal planter over here at Edgecombe. And you had a situation during the crop season where the canes were being drawn. and a juicy cart come up the road. The juicy was a particular type of cane. We call it the juicy cane. It was a soft cane, full of juice and so on. Easy to pull away with your teeth. Easy to suck. And a tractor come up with a load of juicy canes, and you pull out one. The fellows run behind and pull out one. That they happen at Edgecombe. If an Edgecombe tractor come up the road, P134 or one of them come up the road with juicy cane, you getting ready to pull one, you look further, right behind the tractor was Mr. Armstrong driving in that room. I think it was P196 or something. So you had to see that Edgecombe tractor with these juicy canes going up the place and look at it and look off and wait for somebody else. But those were things that affected life in the village. You knew what you could get away with over on this side from what you couldn't get away with over on that side. And you acted accordingly. You acted accordingly. But the village, Brereton, as I said, a village set in between all of these plantations, and over time has developed into a village that has turned out a number of persons who have made their mark in this society.
Later in the series, Hal Gollop will identify a number of those individuals. But let us look now at the spirit of cooperativeness that existed among the members of Brereton community.
People seldom sold things. They were used for home consumption, and somebody would give you a potato or a yam, and you give them a breadfruit and that kind of thing. There was a strong barter system. People gave you some this for some that. There was a spirit of communityness. Miss Gollop had some orchards and so on. She sold some to people who came from around the place and so on. Or Miss Bartlett had something. But generally speaking, there was a greater spirit of cooperativeness. You know, you could go out and so and beg for half a yam or something like that, or a potato, as the case may be. There was very little selling, very little selling. Every now and again, somebody may plant, between the canes, some string beans or something like that. And some hawkers would come at the time, and you could make a few dollars. I remember my cousin was given to doing that. When the canes were done, he would plant spring beans, a quick cash crop, and he would make a $20, which was a lot of money in those days to pocket for a young lad growing up. But there was not a large marketing of produce, as it were. It was they were grown largely for consumption. If you had corn, for example, if you got any of them to the point where they were hard enough to be ground, you took them up to a place there in Mangrove across that road where there was a mill, and you had the corn ground for conkeys. But that is if the small patch of corn was able to survive the onslaught that we put on them to roast them. You would be waiting for those corn ready to be able to put to the fireman to roast. And that was the thing. You produced them for home consumption largely. There was not a large enough acreage to make a commercial profit to call in hawkers or speculators or anybody. The plantation was selling off a field of potatoes. That's when you see the speculators in their carts, or a field of yams or eddos or whatever, or black eyes. Somebody selling black eyes, and you went and you picked your black eyed peas and then took them to the truck to weigh and so on. But that wasn't a feature of the village. What would happen in these villages? There was a family society. And people used to pay a few dollars a week. I remember there was a gentleman who came over from Ebenezer that used to make collections at my grandmother's house. That was the Chiming Bell Society. But there was not really a cooperative movement in its real sense. What you did have was a few enterprising housewives would have a turn, and somebody would put in a $2 a week or something like that, and then you would get, depending on the number of people in it, a payout. And that was a feature of the thing. Now I mentioned that too about turns and so on. A feature of the village was livestock rearing, especially pigs, sheep to a less extent. There weren't many people around here who went into rearing goats. Goat rearing was a much more exclusive thing in those days. But sheep and cows and pigs. Cows to a lesser extent, because a cow was regarded as a more expensive thing to buy, but pigs. And that animal husbandry, if you want to call it that in a wider sense, was important, because the housewife would time the killing of a pig or the selling off of a litter of pigs to the time when she may have to pay school fees. So and so was going to kill a pig. You had a lot of backyard slaughter in those days. And you would go around and engage the meat. So somebody wanted 2 pounds, or somebody was killing a few sheep or something. You went around and you engaged the meat. And that was done for a specific purpose. You had something coming up for which you wanted a bit of money, a bigger than usual amount, and some commitment you had to meet. As I said, like school fees. And that litter of pigs would be sold off to pay the school fees for a child who was going to the modern or to Lynch's Secondary or one of the other schools, or Combermere, because that was before the days of free secondary education. When free secondary education was introduced, for example, I was in third form at Combermere, 1961, I think it was, yeah. And that was a major break for some parents who had to scrunt to pay school fees. And some of those schools, some of the private schools, were not cheap. Yeah, $20 a term and that sort of thing was a lot of money. So you had to find it from somewhere, because wages could not pay for those things. So the people in the village were engaged in husbandry for that purpose too. But it also did something, because the children had to become involved. Going to pick meat for the rabbits or slip for the sheep or something like that, because you were taught that your future also depended on the income, if you want to call it. It was not an income in the real sense of the word, but any little amount you could get from the sale of a sheep or a pig, or from a litter of pigs, and so on. So some useful lessons, again, were taught in the process as a youngster growing up, having to get up early and go and pick rabbit meat or something like that. Your interest was intimately wrapped up in that. It was not just only having the sheep there as a lovely animal to look at, or the pig for that matter. He was he was a source of supplementing the income and to sustain the family development. And those things became very important. Of course, the itinerant people in the village was also a very important aspect of the development in the villages. The itinerant Indians who came around and made it possible for you to get clothing, for uniforms and so on, cloth and for uniforms for the new school year, shoes and so on. That too became a very important aspect of the development of the village, those itinerant Indians, and we got to know them by name, obviously. Of course, they've been here now over, 100 years, I believe. And they had their part to play in the development of these villages as well.
It is important that Hal Gollop paid homage to the itinerant trader, those enterprising men who saw a need in Barbadian communities and filled that need to the satisfaction of many Barbadians. Yes, they played their part in building Barbadian communities during the last 100 years. Now, among the items delivered to homes by those traders was fabric for the village tailors and seamstresses.
A village seamstress, sometimes a village tailor. Yes, we had a few of those in Britain. Tailors, we had a few tailor shops. In my time, I could think about Mr. Edwin Sargent there. Sargent? No, he wasn't Sargent. Anyhow, we called him Joe Bow, Anthony Sargent's father. He was a tailor. My own cousin Ivan Eastman was a tailor. There was a man who was affectionately known to us as Sparky Jones, who was also a tailor. And then there was Mr. Mears up the road. He was he had more than I remember, yeah. We had a number of tailors in the village. And there were not as many seamstresses, maybe one or two, but several more tailors. But of course, there might have been a seamstress in a neighboring village because they became famous. And you went to a particular to a particular lady who was a seamstress wherever she was. And there was Mr. Miller, Clyde Miller. He was a tailor as well. Couldn't imagine we had so many tailors in Britain. Yeah, that's about 6 which I've called in this little village. And those people have now almost gone out of use. The tailor, the advent of ready-made clothes, the tailor who made a pants or a suit to measurement. Bespoke tailors, we used to call them, from a generation, have almost gone out of use, as it were. They're not popular anymore. A few tailors still around. The remnants of the big firm in town, that big tailor firm that we had there in town. There's one gentleman I remember who still was a member of that big establishment. Oh dear, what's it called? I don't remember the name, but a popular tailor firm. J.B. Rice it was? J.B. Rice, I think it was. That was a big tailoring establishment. And that turned out a number of top tailors. And but we have, the reliance now is on ready-made clothes.
There you have it, aspects of the social life of Britain as seen through the lens of Hal Gollop. The program continues next week at the same time. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Take good care of yourself and look out for the interests of your neighbors.